It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this R.M. Jones lecture, hosted here today at Queen's University Belfast by the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. My name is Richard English. I'm Director of the Mitchell Institute, and I'm very grateful to colleagues in the Mitchell Institute and colleagues in the Development and Alumni Relations Office here at Queen's for their work in organising this event. Robert Miller Jones was born in Belfast in 1863. He was a student both of the Royal Belfast Academical Institution and also of Queen's University Belfast. At Queen's, he won first prizes in Greek, in Latin, in French, in German, in English literature and political economy, and went on to become the principal of his old school, Inst, from 1898 until 1925. A member of the first Senate of Queen's from 1908 onwards, R.M. Jones died in 1948 and bequeathed money, quote, for the purpose of establishing public lectures to be delivered by a person of outstanding eminence in the world of learning, letters, science, or philosophy. I'm delighted that today's R.M. Jones lecture will be delivered by Professor David Armitage, unquestionably someone of outstanding eminence. Professor Armitage is the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History at Harvard University, where he teaches intellectual history and international history. He's an Honorary Fellow of St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, an Honorary Professor at the University of Sydney, and I'm delighted to say an Honorary Professor here at Queen's University Belfast. Educated at Cambridge and at Princeton, he taught for 11 years at Columbia University before moving to Harvard in 2004. A prize-winning teacher and writer, Professor Armitage has lectured on 6 continents and has held research fellowships and visiting positions in Australia, in Britain, in China, in France, in Germany, in South Korea, and in the United States. David is the author or editor of 18 books, including Civil Wars, A History in Ideas, published in 2017, The Ideological Origins of the British Empire from 2000, which won the Longman History Today Book of the Year Award, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, published in 2007, and the co-authored book, The History Manifesto from 2014. Professor Armitage is a corresponding Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a corresponding member of the Real Academia de la Historia in Madrid, an Honorary Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and a foreign member of the Academia Europaea. After David's lecture, there'll be the chance for you all to ask him questions, so please do post at any stage your questions through the question and answer function on the screens in front of you, and we look forward to getting through as many of those questions, putting them to David after his lecture. And so to speak on the subject, 1320, 1776 and all that, the Declaration of Arbroath, the Declaration of Independence, and the fate of documents, it's my real pleasure to hand over now to Professor David Armitage.
Thank you so very much, Richard. It's my enormous pleasure to be back here at Queen's University Belfast. One of the many frustrations of the last 2 years has been the inability to travel to see old friends in familiar places, and it's a particular joy, therefore, to be back here at Queen's to see many old friends and colleagues and to be given the signal honor of delivering the R.M. Jones Lecture this year. It's a truth, I think, not sufficiently acknowledged that the more famous a document is, the more likely it is to be misunderstood. Foundational texts accrete myths like barnacles. One task for historians is to clear off the encrustations by returning to original sources. Yet, putting texts back into their contexts, though clearly necessary, is hardly sufficient to fully recover their historical significance. Even later misapprehensions form part of the meaning of such fundamental documents. The historian's remit includes the history of their reception, of the uses they faced, and the abuses they suffered. This task gets increasingly complex and still more demanding when documents become entwined with each other on their historical journeys, either as part of their reception history or in the course of their mythologization. All of these conditions, I submit, apply to the twinned topics of my lecture today, that is, to the 1320 Declaration of Arbroath, so-called, and the 1776 US Declaration of Independence. It applies also, as I hope to again demonstrate, to their distinct afterlives and to their entanglements over time. This is therefore a topic in what might be called the development of ideas over time. Happily, that was the charge given by R.M. Jones to the lecturer he appointed with his generous bequest to lecture precisely on the development of ideas. And as Professor English has already told you, Jones was a very distinguished graduate of two very distinguished institutions here in Belfast, and I cannot begin to parallel his achievements in all of those different fields: Greek, Latin, French, German, English literature, and what was it? Political economy, I think, was the last one as well. But I will do my very best, at least on my own turf, to speak to those concerns in the development of ideas which fit with the charge to the Jones lecturer. Now, 2022, the year, of course, in which we now stand, is almost exactly halfway between the 700th anniversary of Arbroath, as I shall call it from now on, in 2020, and the 250th anniversary coming up of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. Now, I think it's a fair bet to say that more will be said about the Declaration in 2026 than has been said about Arbroath since 2020. Indeed, a National Trust for Scotland poll in 2020 rather depressingly discovered that 51% of Scots, when asked about their opinion of the Declaration of Arbroath, said, "The Declaration of what?" They'd not heard of it. We must hope fervently indeed, that the same could not be said about Americans and their Declaration of Independence when we get to 2026. But anniversaries, we might say, provide opportunities, not just for commemoration, but also for reconsideration. The charge for historians at each moment is to expand understanding and to expunge misunderstanding. Now, with that in mind, and standing between these two anniversaries of the two declarations, what I want to do now is to compare and connect the documents in their own time and in their afterlives. I'll suggest that the histories of their motivation, their production, and their reception have much in common that can in turn illuminate the stories of their misapprehension. And I believe this is a particularly revealing comparison because of the assumption, now rather rampant in the United States, that one declaration depended upon the other. That is, that the 14th century Scottish letter from the Scottish nobility and the barons to Pope John XXII in 1320 was a source, perhaps even the source, for the British-American colonists' declaration of 1776. That indeed is a quite widespread assumption. Hence, the popular term for Arbroath as either the Declaration of Arbroath or the Scottish Declaration of Independence. Just how a rather typical medieval noble petition to the papal court became thought of as a Declaration of Independence is a fascinating story in itself, and one I'll touch upon in a moment. Suffice to say here that, far from Arbroath influencing the US Declaration of Independence, I'll argue that the debt ran in the other direction. That is, that the Declaration of Independence shaped Arbroath. Any lazy assumption that a Scottish Declaration of Independence gave birth to the later American example cannot, I think, be too often debunked. That said, in conclusion, I'll reopen the case for the presence of what we might call Arbroath in Philadelphia by showing how its most famous and most mythologized passage, that is from the Declaration of Arbroath, was in fact sitting right on the desks of those who drafted the US Declaration in 1776. One scholar has termed Arbroath perhaps the best studied document in Scottish history, while another notoriously wondered whether there was anything new to say about, quotes, a document apparently so well known in Scotland. Of course, we know it's not that well known. And that scholar then went on to say many novel and enlightening things about Arbroath. The same, of course, might be said about the Declaration of Independence and its place in the history of the United States. Yet, we might say there's nothing new about saying there's nothing new to say. Would that I had some phrases which were unknown, sayings that were unusual, or new words that had not been used, free of repetition, devoid of the phrases of that familiar language which the ancestors spoke. That quotation comes from the Egyptian scribe Kar Kaper Re Senebu in 2000 BCE. Every historian can feel the force of his lament 4,000 years later. There's really nothing new that we can say. However, we always necessarily reconstruct the past in light of the present, or rather of multiple presents. Divergent perspectives, as much as archival finds, repeatedly disrupt what have been held to be settled truths. Moreover, we've also learned that silences can be as eloquent as presences in history, though they're harder to track down, of course. Those who mythologize documents often assume continuity or impose longevity onto their favored texts. More scrupulous historical work can show how those texts disappear underground, get forgotten, or slumber peacefully before being reanimated at particular moments and for specific purposes. Again, I'll show briefly that all of those conditions pertain to both Arbroath and the Declaration. They become more pointed when the unexpected prominence of the American document raised the fortunes of the Scottish one, albeit rather belatedly, as we'll see. It's only in the last century or so that either Arbroath or the American Declaration have been so well studied, but even then they've only been studied rather inconsistently and intermittently within the last 50 years. The sense of being well studied is recent in each case, and that very contingency ensures that there'll always be much new to say about both. Now, for those of you not as familiar perhaps with the Declaration of Arbroath as with the US Declaration of Independence, I just want to say a couple of things about the content of Arbroath which will help us to understand the connection, or sometimes the imputed connection, between Arbroath on the one hand and the US Declaration on the other. The Declaration of Arbroath, so called, and I'll talk about where that name for it comes from, was in fact a letter from the barons and community of Scotland to Pope John XXII in 1320 in support of the claim to the Scottish throne by Robert I, Robert the Bruce as he's sometimes known. This was to counter English claims to the throne and English aggression up to and including the point of war, and asking for the Pope to intervene, to mediate in the dispute between the English and the Scottish crowns, and also offering as a return for that, the barons and the community of Scotland were offering in return for that mediation by the Pope to join a crusade on behalf of the Pope himself. The document itself, only about 1,000 words, but very pungent, Latin words, of course, delivers an account of the historic continuity of the Scottish people, their movements through the Mediterranean, across what is now the English Channel, and into their current homeland, their current territory in the northern part of Britain, and also lays out the historic continuity of their line of kings, of course, to counter any historical claims by the English to either the territory or the Crown of Scotland itself. Within the document, the authors gave a contractual view of kingship, saying that if for any reason Robert Bruce himself failed to defend the liberties of the Scots, they would drive him out. And anyone else who might consider subjecting them, the Scots, to the English crown, leading to the most famous passage in the document, the most widely quoted, you can see it on biscuit barrels and tea towels to this day in Scotland, which I'll quote briefly here. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up but with life itself. It's that assertion which is often taken to be the heart of the values of independence projected by the Declaration of Arbroath, earning it its vision as a declaration of independence, especially when based upon the claim to historic continuity and independence of any external, particularly English, rulership. Of course, the word independence is not used in the document, neither is the word declaration, and I'll come in a moment to where those terms came from, how they coalesced, and how they were retrospectively applied to this much earlier 14th century document. Now, Arbroath, again as I'll call it, was effectively buried and forgotten for long stretches of its 700-year history. The so-called archive copy of the letter, the one that was dispatched from Scotland to Pope John XXII at Avignon, is now lost. At least it's so far resisted efforts over a couple of centuries by historians to find it in the papal archives. The memory of the document itself and the details of what it said went mostly underground between the 14th century and the second quarter of the 15th century, then for another 150 years before the Scottish lawyer and antiquarian historian Sir George Mackenzie of Rosehaw started its renaissance in the 1680s in his work Observations upon the Laws and Customs of Nations as to Precedency. It then disappeared again for swathes of the 18th and 19th centuries within Scotland and certainly beyond it, until the so-called file copy, the secondary copy of the document, returned in 1829 to Scotland's public records after 2 centuries in private hands, the hands of the Earls of Haddington at their house at Tinningham, where, according to one 19th century historian, it was, quotes, discovered in front of a bathroom fireplace. A housemaid had been so pleased with the parchment and the long strips to which the seals were attached that she thought it would make a useful and beautiful fire screen when the grate was empty, and had used it for that household purpose. Arbroath, of course, had had a very different purpose at the time of its writing in 1320, to persuade the Pope to dial down his anti-Scottish rhetoric and to set to mediating between the English and the Scottish crowns. This led, in due course, through a complicated series of events for which Arbroath was maybe foundational, but was certainly not the only impetus, led by 1328 to the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, which finally acknowledged Bruce's claim to the throne, in which the English finally acknowledged Bruce's claim to the throne and made possible the coronation of the King of Scots. So ultimately, the document, Arbroath, was successful in its aims, backed by military force and a series of other diplomatic maneuvers, some of which I'll mention briefly in a second. Now, once that purpose had been served, that is, to get the acknowledgement by the English of the legitimate Scottish claim to the crown, once that purpose had been served, it remained a matter of record, only of interest to the few who were especially obsessed with documents, as one historian has put it. It would take the peculiar and distorting pressures of later moments to fashion Arbroath into something its authors did not conceive and would not have recognized, variously a charter of national identity, an early statement of popular sovereignty, a Scottish Magna Carta. Least of all could they have understood it as a source text for the American Declaration, of course. Arbroath largely sat out broader political conversation in Scotland because it became inappropriate or inassimilable to the needs of the time. For example, because its ideas did not fit within what a former Queen's colleague, Colin Kidd, has classically called the banal unionism in Scotland that was characteristic between the mid-18th and the mid-20th centuries. Arbroath's continuous history within Scottish national, and indeed nationalist, culture goes back, in fact, only to the 1940s. The reception history of the US Declaration was, in fact, similarly patchy, though, of course, on a rather shorter timescale. It, too, had had a particular aim in 1776, specifically to attract foreign support for the anti-imperial revolt by British American colonists who asserted their independence of Great Britain, its crown and its parliament, and justified that rebellion with normative arguments and a roll call of what they believed to be unredressed grievances. Within a little over 18 months, the infant United States, this was really the birth certificate of the United States, the first public document in which those words, United States of America, were used. Within a little over 18 months, the infant United States had secured a treaty of amity and commerce with France in February 1778. 5 years later, to fast forward, Britain acknowledged American independence in the Peace of Paris of 1783. The Declaration's work done for almost half a century after 1783, the Declaration of Independence, like Arbroath 450 years earlier, remained mostly a slumbering matter of record. And much as Arbroath had remained indigestible within Scotland's prevailing political consensus for 2 centuries, so the US Declaration stood athwart political debate in the early American Republic. For example, in the wake of the French Revolution, it smacked of Jacobinism, an anti-British sentiment, at least to white Americans, who did not embrace it as so-called American scripture, as it was once classically called, until sometime after the War of 1812. Even then, the US Declaration did not attain its foundational status, which it carries even to this day, at least again among white Americans, until the United States started to become a singular noun, that is after the Civil War, rather than United States plural, United States singular. Until that moment, until the aftermath of the Civil War, the Declaration's most consistent remembrances had been African Americans, from the Connecticut preacher Lemuel Haynes, who preached a sermon in the late summer of 1776, alluding to the promises of equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and being the first African American to apply those to his own people, all the way to the towering freedman Frederick Douglass, who in the 1850s in particular, in his towering speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, used the normative premises of the second paragraph of the Declaration, its self-evident truths about human equality in particular, to judge their white countrymen. Indeed, it would take Abraham Lincoln to transmute the Declaration from what he termed old wadding left to rot on the battlefield after the victory was won into the bearer of universal truths and the foundational document of American national identity that it remains for most Americans to this day. The Scottish document, we might say, has yet to find its Lincoln, though various Scots since Mackenzie of Rosehaw in the late 17th century have tried to take on a recuperative role for Arbroath. The belated status of Arbroath and the Declaration within their respective national mythologies in Scotland and in the United States may in fact have obscured features of their historical origins that make them, if not quite kindred, then certainly akin to one another. The most obvious of those connections, before coming to their conceptual content, is that both began life as diplomatic documents. Arbroath was in fact just one move in a game of what one historian has called diplomatic beggar my neighbour that was played out between England under Edward II and Scotland under Robert Bruce at the papal court. For all its saber-rattling rhetoric, or we might say claymore-rattling rhetoric, about driving out kings, Scots' freedom, the slaughter of bodies, the perdition of souls, and all the other misfortunes that will follow, Arbroath was an essentially defensive document within an ongoing peace process overseen by the papal curia, the papal court. At the behest of the English crown, John XXII had repeatedly excommunicated Robert Bruce. In an escalation of that dispute, the Pope demanded that the Scots king and 4 of his bishops appear in Avignon to account or atone for their continuing aggression, as he argued it, against the English invaders. Arbroath was the immediate documentary and strategic response to that heavy-handed but no doubt sincere papal move to restore the peace between the two kingdoms. That is, Arbroath was diplomatic in both the original sense of the term, describing a particular kind of physical text, a diploma, a two-sided document, and in its extended meaning, diplomatic, that is, as an adjective, relating to a particular kind of negotiation among sovereign agents. Arbroath was a maneuver in an iterative game that had been in play for at least 2 decades before 1320 and would continue for almost another decade after it. The most public and most destructive set of moves was on the battlefield, of course, but alongside that ran the repeated exchanges of diplomatic documents, among them Arbroath. The historical recovery of that game, of its rules and of its counters, has definitively clarified that Arbroath was hardly the singular cry of the Scottish people, a unique expression of their soul in 1320, uttered once and yet for all time. It was in fact just one example among many at the time of similar baronial letters dispatched to the papacy from the frontier nations of Poland, Ireland, Lithuania, and indeed Scotland in the previous century. And it's been shown to have shared many of the features of that genre, notably a conception of a unitary nation or community of the realm, the communitas regni, a genealogical history that undergirded the idea of nationhood, an attachment to historic rights which appeared to be under threat and needed defense, an appeal to the Pope for his aid in that defense, and a specific rhetorical repertoire, the so-called medieval art of rhetoric, the ars dictaminis, that rendered those appeals legible and potentially persuasive within the specific literary and legal culture of the papal court itself. In this sense, Arbroath was not remotely unique. In particular, it also drew upon a nearly contemporary diplomatic letter also addressed to Pope John XXII, only 3 years earlier, the Irish Remonstrance of 1317, and it drew upon both the substance and the structure of that letter, as other historians have recently shown. That letter, very briefly, also rejected the claim of English overlordship, using the same rhetorical structure as Arbroath, using the same historical narrative or similar historical narrative, similar claims to continuity, and the identification, ultimately, of a rightful king, also, not coincidentally perhaps, from the Bruce family as well. Now, these details of the generic form of Arbroath, its relation to similar baronial documents at the time, its linkages with the Irish Remonstrance of 1317, are relatively familiar to Scottish historians now. But I think they bear repeating, both to recall the tactical purposes behind Arbroath and to establish what its authors, whether those in whose name it was issued, the nobles and community of Scotland, or whoever drafted the letter, specifically in the jargon of the papal chancery. What those people were trying to achieve within the rules of the game they were playing so consciously and so deftly and ultimately successfully. Almost 4.5 centuries later, the US Declaration of Independence was part of a similar series of diplomatic and documentary maneuvers. In the 18 months or so before July 1776, the Continental Congress had issued 15 other state papers addressed to a variety of audiences around the British Empire. The British people, the inhabitants of Quebec, the people of Ireland, the Assembly of Jamaica, the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederation, the province of Canada, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, and King George III himself. These papers, many of them similar in form to at least parts of the Declaration of Independence, were much more disparate, of course, than the barons' letters of the 13th and 14th centuries in their arguments, in their addressees, and especially in their genre. Because they were all printed, they were also public, and quite deliberately so, in a manner that obviously could not have been true of Arbroath, an artifact from centuries before the age of mechanical reproduction. These papers, issued by the Continental Congress, were public in different ways because they were addressed to different publics in the plural. As Congress's strategy, its public relations strategy, we might say, changed in light of the shifting military situation in North America, the state of opinion around the British Atlantic Empire, and the responses of both Parliament and the King to their imprecations. Congress directed most of its arguments before July 1776 to specific British communities in Ireland, Quebec, or Jamaica, for instance, with the aim of garnering support by implying conspiracies or policies that might affect other British communities next. Only in the 1776 Declaration itself did Congress finally speak to the so-called opinions of mankind as a whole. That shift in appeal from other British settler communities to what we might now call global public opinion enacted what the Declaration itself hoped to achieve. That is, a place for the United States of America among the powers of the earth, no longer in allegiance to the British Crown or under the authority of the British Parliament. The Scottish signatories 400 years earlier had sent Arbroath to Avignon expecting further exchanges and more conventional correspondence with the papacy as their diplomatic game continued. By contrast, Congress in 1776 published their declaration then to the whole world to show that they were exiting one game within the orbit of British sovereignty, whether parliamentary or royal, to join an entirely different one, a community of sovereign entities known as the great powers of the earth. Petitioning was another pre-modern game that Scottish nobles and British American colonists, all operating within hierarchical monarchical regimes, would have well understood. Arbroath itself was, at least in part, generically a petition. It was, in this sense, a submission of grievances addressed to a superior, in this case a spiritual superior, the Pope, in hopes of eliciting an action that would be a form of redress. The Scots beseeched John the 22nd, their reverend father and lord, with, quotes, their most earnest prayers and suppliant hearts to look with paternal eyes on the troubles and anxieties brought by the English upon us and upon the Church of God, to leave in peace us Scots. Similarly, in 1775, the Continental Congress had directed its so-called Olive Branch petition to King George III, quotes, beseeching His Majesty that his royal authority and influence may be graciously interposed to procure us, the colonists, relief from our afflicting fears and jealousies, to settle peace through every part of your dominions. And the language is recognizably similar because of the petitioning form, because of the monarchical hierarchical structure, and because of the dance between grievances and their potential redress and the forms of submission necessary, at least to begin the process of persuading the superior to redress those grievances. Scots and colonists alike, indeed, knew that only humble submission could possibly lead to that redress, but in each case they did so amid active combat, as it were with a sword in one hand and an olive branch in the other. In the case of the colonists, this was almost literally the case, as their olive branch petition to the king in 1775 was accompanied at the same time by a declaration, quotes, by the representatives of the United Colonies setting forth the causes and necessity of their taking up arms. Directed in this case not to the king, but instead to the rest of the world, and like the more famous declaration a year later, published precisely to shape the opinions of, quotes, mankind. It's been said of Arbroath that, quotes, the deft grammatical maneuverings of that document mark it as a piece of careful propaganda directed towards a specific diplomatic situation. Exactly those words would apply to the Declaration of 1776. In 1320 and in 1775-76, each group of petitioners, Scots nobles, members of the Congress, the American Congress, was keeping its diplomatic options open as they pursued parallel paths rhetorically and militarily at the same time. So Arbroath and the Declaration, I think, each come into sharper historical focus when considered as diplomatic documents produced from within a culture of petitioning from inferiors to superiors. In this regard, Arbroath may actually have more in common, for example, with the Olive Branch petition or the 1775 Declaration on taking up arms than it does to this extent with the 1776 Declaration. After all, one of the many reasons that the authors of the 1776 Declaration offered to justify their independence was, quotes, that our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. In that indifference to the suffering of his people lay the final, even culminating cause for casting off their monarchical allegiance to George III. Unlike the Scottish earls and barons who threatened to drive out Robert I if he dared to make them or their kingdom, quote, subject to the kings of England or the English, the representatives of what were to become the United States were abandoning a king who, they claimed, not only failed to protect them, but had committed numerous grave injuries against them. By symbolically cutting off the king's head in this way and throwing off their allegiance, the ci-devant colonists effected a shift in their collective political personality that would indeed have been unimaginable to their Scottish predecessors. Arbroath was, if anything, a declaration of dependence, dependence, that is, on the papacy and more generally upon the institution of monarchy, by seeking John XXII's intercession and by threatening to find a substitute king, not a substitute for kingship, should their current ruler become what they called an enemy and a subverter of his right and ours. In this fundamental sense, 1320 cannot be seen, as two historians once called it, as a Caledonian 1776. Rather, I think 1320 was a Caledonian 1775 due to that parallel between Arbroath and the Declaration on taking up arms of that year. However, in a fundamental sense, Arbroath and the Declaration were both contingent documents. That's to say, they were tied to specific purposes and contexts by agents who knew precisely the limits of language and hence the possibilities for persuasion available to them. Another way to describe this is to call the two documents rhetorical, not in the vulgar meaning of that term, but rather in its technical sense of being written to persuade using an inherited armory of recognized tropes and figures. The rhetorical artistry of Arbroath has been clear indeed since the 1940s, when two scholars nearly simultaneously identified first its detailed debt to the Roman historian of embattled liberty Sallust, the source of the most famous quotation from Arbroath that I cited earlier, and then the document's broader use of that medieval art of rhetoric, the ars dictaminis. Such reliance on Latin rhetoric came, of course, more naturally to a document written in that language, the diplomatic vernacular of its day, a language reaching back to Rome and carrying forward the Roman heritage of rhetorical tropes and figures. But it did also ensure that Arbroath's argument would fall easily to hand if and when the Pope were, for example, to issue a bull against Edward II and his designs against Scotland. It was a modular document from which pieces could easily have been taken. The authors of Arbroath targeted their language with precision. Once its contingent purposes had been served, it was, as Abraham Lincoln might have said, left on the battlefield, to be cannibalized for parts or interpreted towards ends its creators could not have envisaged and likely would not have endorsed, such as the construction of a subsequent Scottish nationalism in the 20th century. The US Declaration, again to carry on the parallel, was also thoroughly rhetorical. It was written in the language of the empire, English, but constructed in order to maximize its rhetorical impact by using a mix of legal genre conventional at its time. Even more than Arbroath, in fact, the Declaration has been shown to be a piece of textual bricolage, sutured together largely by Thomas Jefferson in his role as primary drafter from various pieces, such as Congress's Resolution for Independence, approved on the 2nd of July, 1776, the preamble that Jefferson himself had written for Virginia's Constitution, and his fellow Virginian George Mason's 1776 Declaration of Rights, along with supporting historical material, again, from Jefferson's own work, the Summary View of the Rights of British America from 1774. All of this was to prove, quotes, that these united colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, as the final paragraph of the Declaration concluded conclusively, QED. Now, the Declaration did not just combine material from a range of previous documents, like some Frankenstein's monster jerry-rigged out of fundamental freedoms. It was also generically eclectic, and therefore necessarily backward-looking, because built from existing forms. The second paragraph, of course, it's most famous. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It begins, that second paragraph comprised a declaration of rights, albeit one strictly subordinate to the Declaration's primary purpose of asserting the independence of colonies as now states among other states. As Abraham Lincoln again put it, the assertion that, quotes, all men are created equal was, Lincoln went on, of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain in 1776. It was placed, Lincoln argued, not for that, but for future use. Only the final paragraph of the document was in fact a declaration of independence, as it publicized the resolution that the members of the Continental Congress had ratified on the 2nd of July. Almost all the separate parts of the Declaration, therefore, were unoriginal. Almost all were repurposed from texts written in the preceding months and years. However, the rhetorical combination of them was original, as the very term Declaration of Independence itself was. Those words, Declaration of Independence, had not appeared in English or their equivalents in any other European language before 1776. Though the term Declaration of Independence, with a Y at the end, with a political meaning, had appeared just once, as far as I can discover, in 1775. Now, to bring that knowledge back for a moment to Arbroath, it would be fair to say that Arbroath could not have been considered as a Scottish Declaration of Independence any time before 1776, for the simple reason that no foundational document of any kind had been defined or denoted as such till then, at the very earliest. It was also because it was not until the mid-18th century that any people had used the language of independence to declare their nationhood. When the British Americans announced that their former colonies were now free and independent states, they were speaking, in fact, an avant-garde, cutting-edge legal idiom. That idiom had various convergent sources, but the most immediate, the most prestigious, and the most operative came from the contemporary law of nations, what we describe today as the language of international law. The reigning authority on that subject at the time was the Swiss diplomat and jurist Emma de Vattel, whose elegant compendium, aptly entitled The Law of Nations, Le Droit des Gens, of 1758, had cornered the market and indeed swept the world for almost a century after its publication in 1758. Vattel repeatedly reminded his readers that human beings had originally been, quotes, free and independent in a state of nature. Once they joined together to form nations or states, those bodies, the nations or states, took on the characteristics of the people who had made them up and became, therefore, in turn, free and independent themselves, and now in an international state of nature. Now, this language is worth stressing for two reasons. First, that Vattel's work, as I'll mention in a second, is the only one we can prove to have been in the hands of the drafters of the Declaration. The second reason, as we'll also see later, is that Vattel provides, so far, what may be the missing link between Arbroath on the one hand and the US Declaration on the other, and I'll come to that in conclusion. We know why the Declaration spoke of free and independent states in Vattel's voice, and that's because Benjamin Franklin told us so. In late 1775, Franklin hunted down copies of this latest expanded edition of Vattel's work that had been issued in Amsterdam that year, because, as he wrote to its editor, the circumstances of a rising state make it necessary frequently to consult the law of nations. Franklin secured 3 copies, one of them for the Continental Congress itself, whose members apparently lapped it up, at least according to Franklin's account. As he wrote again to the work's editor in December 1775, Vattel's Droit des Gens has, quotes, been continually in the hands of the members of our Congress now sitting. I've documented elsewhere the importance of Vattel's Law of Nations for the Declaration. Suffice it to say here that that distinctly modern idiom of Vattel's Law of Nations, that is, of states as free and independent, was as conspicuously absent from Arbroath as it was fundamentally constitutive of the essence of the US Declaration. The so-called Declaration of Arbroath, conceived first, in fact, at New Battle Abbey, but composed at Arbroath, was not a declaration. It never spoke of independence. In this basic sense, the two documents could hardly have been more different, conceptually and generically. The one genre capacious enough to contain both Arbroath and the Declaration, at least in the 18th and early 19th centuries, was in fact the genre of the manifesto. The influence of the aesthetic avant-garde of the early 20th century has concentrated the meaning of manifesto almost exclusively around statements of artistic originality, with the conspicuous exception of the Communist Manifesto and of party political platforms in Britain today. When Marx and Engels fired off their eponymous salvo, the Communist Manifesto, they knew well that the primary meaning of manifesto in their own time, in 1848, was military and diplomatic. Manifestos then were public pronouncements by sovereign agents of revolutionary or destructive events, couched as justifications for embarking on such disruptive actions as invasions, wars, or changes of regime. Manifestos were explanatory and they were public. They literally, therefore, made manifest to a wider world or to public opinion the reasons why sovereign actors had embarked on radical actions. The Declaration was, for much of its length, just such a manifesto. Contemporary diplomatic language, contemporary that is to 1776, defined a declaration in the exchanges between sovereigns as an international announcement, or as one contemporary author put it, as, quotes, a general manifesto published to all the world, such as a declaration of war, and the Declaration of Independence was indeed also a declaration of war, or even, at this point, a declaration of independence itself. It was for just this reason that Thomas Paine, in his Common Sense of February 1776, urged the necessity of, quotes, a, quotes, manifesto to be published and dispatched to foreign courts to bring legitimacy to the American cause and to achieve a military and commercial assistance for it. Paine imagined a Declaration of Independence before such a thing even existed. Declarations of independence were a novelty without precedent before the summer of 1776, at least as international documents. Manifestos, however, were not, and that's why he used that language of a manifesto. And the Declaration would have been immediately recognizable within that genre, the manifesto genre, even though it would take decades for it to establish a new genre within which other documents could be understood imitatively also as declarations of independence. Now, I give this background just to show where the language to describe Arbroath comes from and how belated it was. It was indeed almost a century after 1776 before anyone identified Arbroath as a, or even the, Scottish Declaration of Independence. That is, only once the US Declaration itself had recovered from its taint of revolutionary Jacobinism after 1815, and after it had become a fundamental charter for the United States after the Civil War, not least thanks to major figures like Frederick Douglass and especially Abraham Lincoln. I think it's significant in this regard that when Arbroath was adventitiously published on the eve of the US Civil War in New York in March 1861, it was not linked to the US Declaration. In fact, it was not until 1870 that two authors, the great Scottish antiquarian Cosmo Innes and the English jurist and colonial administrator Edward Shepherd Creasy, first called Arbroath a Declaration of Independence. For Innes, in the 1870 introduction to the Facsimiles of National Manuscripts of Scotland, quotes, "The Baron's letter was surely the noblest burst of patriotic feeling, the finest declaration of independence that real history has to show." Yet it seems to have been the Englishman Creasy who was first to use the exact term Scottish Declaration of Independence to describe Arbroath in print that same year, 1870, in the index to his History of England from the earliest to the present time, which Creasy published from Sri Lanka while he was Chief Justice then of Ceylon. Creasy there described and paraphrased Arbroath in his text, though he mistook both its date, citing 1318 rather than 1320, and its origin, calling it a memorial of the Scottish Parliament to the Pope, not the nobles. Moreover, Creasy struggled to find the right frame to make the letter familiar to his readers, as, apart from calling it a Scottish Declaration of Independence, he also described it in 17th century terms, we might say, as, quotes, the Grand Remonstrance addressed to the Pope. Until the time of Innes and Creasy, that is the 1870s, if Arbroath was called anything other than a letter, it was termed a manifesto, the genre, as I've shown, that it shared with the Declaration of Independence in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Indeed, Creasy, the English historian I just mentioned, himself referred to it as, quotes, this manifesto. This was a change. The first three printings of Arbroath, in the English language at least, in translation between 1689 and 1703, had all been entitled A Letter from the Nobility, Barons and Commons of Scotland in the year 1320. The next twist on its title came in 1705, when its first historian, the Presbyterian Whig James Anderson, whom we'll meet again in a moment, set it within a sequence of evidence to prove that the Crown and Kingdom of Scotland had long been independent, and included Arbroath alongside other early 14th century remonstrances as one of what Anderson called, again this is 1705, the remaining excellent manifestos of our independency. So by 1705 it was describable as a manifesto of independency, not yet a declaration thereof. By the early 19th century, to fast forward another 100 years, manifesto had become the term of art for Arbroath, that famous manifesto addressed to Pope John, quotes, a celebrated and energetic manifesto, or most notably what Sir Walter Scott at the time called, quotes, a spirited manifesto or memorial, in which strong sense and a manly spirit of freedom are mixed with arguments suited, however, to the ignorance of the age. So long as Arbroath and the Declaration were each thought of as manifestos, and before the genre of manifesto itself had been irreversibly transvalued from diplomatic and revolutionary and to artistic in the decades following 1848, Arbroath would not be typified as any kind of declaration, least of all a Declaration of Independence. Should we then perhaps be celebrating not the 700th or 702nd birthday of the Declaration of Arbroath, but rather the birthday of the New Battle Manifesto? Now, that we're not celebrating something now called the New Battle Manifesto is one sign, I think, of the global impact of the US Declaration itself, well beyond the United States. Beginning in the 1810s, during the implosion of Spanish America after Napoleon's invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 1808, declarations of independence, more often called in the Hispanic legal tradition Actas de Independencia, blossomed and proliferated, sometimes in direct imitation of the North American original, but increasingly independently of it. If we fast forward 2 centuries to our own time, we can now see that more than half the states represented at the United Nations have a fundamental text either called a Declaration of Independence or approximating to one. As the numbers of such documents, of such declarations of independence were issued and nationhood became fused with statehood across the 19th century, the hunt was on for foundational documents that could be retrospectively baptized as declarations of independence, even when the documents themselves had not adopted that terminology, when they did not declare independence, and when they did not arise, as most declarations in the 19th and 20th centuries have in fact done, from anti-colonial or anti-imperial secession. Of course, Arbroath did not arise from such a secession. The most illuminating parallel with Arbroath in this respect is the 1581 Plakat van Felletinga, or the Act of Abjuration, issued by the Spanish Netherlands during the Dutch revolt against Spain in 1581. The States General then did what the Scots had only threatened to do in 1320, that is, to throw off allegiance to their prince, in the Dutch case, King Philip of Spain. Yet, like their Scottish predecessors, they did not abjure monarchy itself. They sought only what they called another powerful and merciful prince to protect and defend themselves. This other so-called Declaration of Independence therefore rhymed with Arbroath, but it did not directly echo it. Just as Arbroath would come for a time to be termed the Scottish Declaration of Independence, so the Dutch Plakat would be known as the Dutch Declaration of Independence. Unlike Arbroath, which was mostly so-called within Scotland itself, the Dutch declaration, so-called as a Declaration of Independence, was an American creation. Within the Netherlands, it retained its historic name, the Plakat van Felletinga, and it was only in the United States, as a result of late 19th century burst of what's been called Holland mania, that Dutch document from the late 16th century was retroactively rebaptized as a Declaration of Independence, in homage to the links between the two transatlantic republics. Equally striking, I think, in this regard is the discontinuity between Scottish constructions of Arbroath as a Declaration of Independence and American assumptions that Arbroath was a source or some kind of urtext for the US Declaration itself. After the very first uses of the term Scottish Declaration of Independence in the late 19th century, Arbroath only began to be called that with any regularity in the 1930s, but the heyday of this nomenclature, the Scottish Declaration of Independence, was between the 1950s and the 1990s, and then mostly in political and heritage sources, as one scholar has recently shown. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it was largely thanks to three women, Annie Dunlop, Agnes Muir Mackenzie, pictured here, and Mary Peyton Ramsay, that Arbroath became best known as a declaration at all in their various publications. It was also surely no accident that Arbroath became a Declaration of Independence during the very era of decolonization in the 50s and 60s, for instance, and at the moment of the rise of US hegemony after the Second World War. Provincial nationalists within empires could see their own glorious future in the seeds sown by British Americans' precocious anti-imperial secession, while those locked within composite monarchies and seeking their freedom might take the American founding charter as a textual inspiration. I think we can therefore be confident that the US Declaration of Independence influenced the Declaration of Arbroath, that is, how Arbroath was read, how Arbroath was received, and how Arbroath was constructed in the 20th century, if not, of course, in the 14th century. These currents, these 20th century currents, partly explain how the New Battle Manifesto turned into the Scottish Declaration of Independence, at least in some nationalist circles. However, they do not account for the mirroring process, that is, the process by which the Declaration was revealed as indebted to Arbroath. That alleged genetic connection between Arbroath and the US Declaration is in fact very recent. It goes back barely half a century to the US Congressional Resolution of March 1998, proclaiming the 6th of April each year as National Tartan Day, an invented tradition if ever there was one. The arguments for that invention included the supposed parallel between 1320 and 1776 and the imputed convergence between the two documents, with Arbroath proposed as the model or template for the US Declaration. As I hope to have suggested briefly already, there could be no single model for such a complex text, and thus no unique source for it, whether Arbroath or anything else. Stark attribution of ancestry to Arbroath is accordingly an error. But just because it's erroneous does not mean there was no connection at all between these two documents. Now, other historians have noted that Arbroath was almost entirely absent from historiography in the Scottish Enlightenment and from the works of rhetoric, belles lettres, and moral philosophy that bridged England's two cultural provinces, that is, on the one hand Scotland and the British American colonies on the other in the 18th century. However, that does not mean that absence from historiography and works of literature, for instance, does not mean that Arbroath was entirely unavailable in 1776 on the other side of the Atlantic, or therefore there was no access to Arbroath in Philadelphia. Cheap print and handy translations were not the only vehicle for Arbroath's uptake in the Age of Revolutions. Indeed, the primary vector for Arbroath in this period, in the second half of the 18th century, was the work of the great Jacobite Latinist Thomas Ruddiman. His bulky and expensive, indeed luxurious and exclusive edition of the Whig antiquary James Anderson's Diplomata Scotii, or to give its full title, the Selectus Diplomatum et Numismatum Scotii Thesaurus, finally published in Edinburgh in 1739 after a long gestation and after Anderson's own death. There was a copy of this prestige object in George III's library. It now resides in the British Library in London. This is a photograph of George III's copy of the Diplomata Scotii. It was in Anderson's Diplomata that James Boswell lighted upon Arbroath with friends while browsing the Ratsbibliothek in Leipzig in October 1764. Here's Boswell's report of that encounter. "My old spirit got up, and I read some choice passages of the Baron's letter to the Pope." This is in Latin in the Diplomata. "They were struck, his friends were struck, with the noble sentiments of the liberty of the old Scots. They expressed their regret at the shameful union. I felt true patriot sorrow. O infamous rascals, who sold the honour of your country to a nation against which our ancestors supported themselves with so much glory." 4 years after that encounter, in 1768, Boswell placed Arbroath's Sallusthian sentence in Latin prominently on the title page of his account of Corsica. And here's translating the famous Latin passage again. "For we fight not for glory, nor riches, nor honours, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life." He signalled his debt to Anderson with the motto, calling Arbroath the Lit Comet et Baron Scotii ad Pap AD 1320. The Diplomata was the only publication before 1768 to give it that precise Latin title, so that was clearly the source for Boswell's Latin. More importantly, perhaps, Boswell made the first connection between Arbroath and an independence struggle in the Age of Revolutions, in this case Pasquale Paoli's revolt in Corsica. It would not be the only such linkage. So in conclusion, I want to return briefly to the jurist from Neuchâtel, Emma de Vattel. In the first book of his Droit des gens, Vattel faced the unavoidable question of whether a nation may constrain a tyrant and withdraw itself from his obedience, a problem that both the Scots in 1320 and, in their own minds at least, the British Americans in 1776 had faced. To answer the question at his own time, Vattel reminded his readers of the ends of civil society. And here I quote, "Is it not to labour in concert for the common happiness of all? Was it not with this in view that every citizen divested himself of his rights and resigned his liberty? A sovereign, he argued, had to use his delegated authority, quotes, for the safety of the people, salus populi, and not for their ruin. If a sovereign egregiously attacked these rights to what, to coin a phrase, one might call life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then that sovereign could be resisted," Vattel argued. "The people could pass judgment on him, and they would at last have the right to withdraw their obedience. Still, his person should be spared, and that for the welfare of the state." So no cutting off the king's head, anything other than metaphorically. Now, the posthumous 1773 Amsterdam edition of Vattel's work footnoted that the conclusion of that argument with two long passages in Latin. The first from the 16th century Spanish Jesuit monarchomach Juan de Mariana. To this authority furnished by Spain, Vattel's Dutch editor, Dumas, continued, "Join that of Scotland, proved by the letter of the barons to the Pope, dated April the 6th, 1320. followed again by a lengthy Latin quotation, in this case the entire middle paragraph of Arbroath, concluding with, "But from these countless evils we have been set free, we fight, not for glory, nor riches, nor honours, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life. Non enim propter gloriam divitias aut honores pugnamus, sed propter libertatem solemn modo, quam nemo bonus nisi simul cum vita amitit." William of Ockham was a contemporary of Arbroath. He may never actually have said that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily, but Ockham's razor-sharp principle of parsimony, if it was his or just attributed to him, when applied to historical explanation, does require that probability and proximity trump speculation and similarity. In the case of Arbroath and the Declaration, we don't need to propose, as some patriotic historians have argued, we don't need to propose vague, insubstantial invocations of Arbroath as a model or a template for the US Declaration. We can also avoid any imputed elective affinity between democratic nationalist Scots on the one hand and independence-minded British Americans on the other. Nor do we need, for example, to conjure up Scottish ancestry for signers of the Declaration, or even to excavate the Scots-inflected education of its framers, if we want now to posit Arbroath as one among the possible sources of the US Declaration. Instead, we can now point to the long footnote in the specific edition of the only source that we definitely know from contemporary testimony, Franklin's testimony, to have been, quotes, continually in the hands of the members of our Continental Congress. Therefore, if there is a winding road from Arbroath and Avignon to Philadelphia, then it might have run through Neuchâtel and Amsterdam, along the channels of enlightened late Latinity and the burgeoning law of nations. Absence of evidence, it's said, is not evidence of absence. Equally, one might say, the presence of evidence is not evidence of the presence, in this case, of Arbroath in the Declaration. Yet, at the very least, this connection might cause us to reconsider 1320, 1776, and all that, thereby to retell the tale of these two so-called declarations. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed for that contextually sophisticated and very subtle lecture, which I suspect R.M. Jones would have loved, actually, for all sorts of reasons, so thank you. The audience now have the chance to put their questions to Professor Armitage. Do please post those through the Q&A function on the screens in front of you. Some questions already coming in. I'm going to begin with those, but please do keep them coming in. The first question, David, begins with a quotation from something that you said, where you said, "The Scottish document is yet to find its Lincoln. The Scottish document is yet to find its Lincoln." And the question is that at all possible within a union, or will it first demand independence?
Very pointed question, yes. So, of course, Lincoln is the great reinventor of the US Declaration. He speaks of it as the apple and the silver frame, the relationship that is between the Declaration and the Constitution, welding the two of them together as foundational documents which should not be parted, the foundational values of the second paragraph of the Declaration thereby being fixed as the fundamental values underlying the Constitution and therefore the Union. An act, of course, which had to take place in the face of fission and secession and warfare. So we hope that nothing like that will come, no replay of some of the Anglo-Scottish wars of the 14th century. And indeed, within independence, if that were to happen, that's another speculation well beyond my pay grade, it seems unlikely one would need a Lincoln in quite the same way to repurpose that document, especially because of some of the elements of alienness that I wanted to point to that would make it, I think, inappropriate and possibly inoperable under 21st or maybe 22nd century circumstances whenever independence might come for Scotland.
Thank you, David. Next question, not entirely unrelated. Would an independent Scotland need a new foundational statement of independence? And given all these continuities, could it say anything new? Would an independent Scotland need a new foundational statement of independence? And given all these continuities, could it say anything new?
It would certainly have to have a new foundation, possibly a new Bill of Rights or a new set of human rights documents, perhaps patterned after European human rights documents, for instance, but I suspect those would be more the province of constitutional lawyers than of patriots, nationalists, or the equivalents of those scribes who spoke the jargon of the papal court at that time. So there would probably be less stirring because of their need to be more fundamental in a more highly contentious, legalistic and constitutionalized culture.
Thank you. Next question says, thank you so much for your talk. Did the Reformation in the 16th century change the way that Scottish thinkers engaged with the Declaration of Arbroath? Did the Reformation in the 16th century change the way that Scottish thinkers engaged with the Declaration of Arbroath?
Remarkably little, in fact, as far as we can tell. That's one of those periods where, in the 16th century, where Arbroath largely goes underground to be rediscovered only in the late 17th century. There are, of course, other fundamental documents from the 16th, particularly from the 17th century, often religiously inflected in Scottish political, legal and religious culture, but Arbroath does not seem to intersect very much with those in terms of its reception history. And I'm struck, as other historians have been struck, by those discontinuities in its reception precisely at moments where one might have imagined, as the questioner I think justifiably does, that it would have gained new prominence and new electricity, as it were, within a charged environment, but it seems not to have done, no.
Thank you. Next question. You referred to the different receptions for the Declaration among white Americans and African Americans. Could you say something about how the divided America of 2022 sees the Declaration?
Yes, we may need more opinion polling about this, just to find out both how many Americans can recognize parts of the Declaration itself. I would imagine that many Americans believe that it does. The Declaration of Independence begins with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Indeed, President Obama noted in one of his autobiographical reflections that his grandmother, when he was in Indonesia, would quote the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence to him, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Well, that's missing one paragraph at least, but how many Americans would know the content of the Declaration? Many, of course, still read it, very movingly indeed, on July 4th. But it is a document itself of division, of secession, of rupture, and it has that revolutionary and radical and disruptive potential to it as well. We shall be very interested, I think, to see what happens in 2026. That is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Where there are already many exhibits and other commemorations of 1776 in train now in this particular political moment, but a political moment where we could imagine all three branches of government held by the Republicans, for instance, would be a very different atmosphere for receiving and interpreting the nature of the founding. We remember the 1776 Commission that Trump set up as one of his final acts in office. It went nowhere, but one can imagine that itself being revived. So I think 2022 may be a breathing space, but 2026 is very likely to be a battleground, and I imagine the Declaration of Independence, the appropriation of that by different groups, will become a major bone of contention then.
He might then again be president.
I think it's exceedingly likely he will be president then, yes.
Thank you. Do keep these questions coming in. We're going to get a chance to put them to Professor Armitage, so thank you very much for those that have come in. Next question says, could you say more about silences in history and how historians should deal with them? Could you say more about silences in history and how historians should deal with them?
I feel at this point I should say nothing in order to imitate the silences. But what I was trying to illustrate in these particular cases, just to be concrete about it, is the way in which patriotic mythologizers wish us to believe in the continuity and indeed the perpetuity of some fundamental statements or monuments or documents or figures, whereas a more subtle and patient excavation of the histories, the multiple and punctuated histories of such historical objects shows there are periods of ignorance, amnesia, forgetting, sometimes deliberate suppression, which create discontinuities. And so we have to ask ourselves, for instance, why was it that the Declaration of Independence is not invoked except very glancingly on a couple of occasions, in all of the vast documentary record of the ratification of the Constitution around 1788. Why does Tocqueville not mention the Declaration in his Democracy in America in 1835, a point at which, indeed, we do have evidence that it was gaining wider popular prominence. But to ask those questions about silences demands that excavation to see where there may be gaps, then to inquire, well, what was it about the content or the form or the purchase or the goals of a document like the American Declaration which would make it inoperable or unnecessary at certain moments, or indeed repellent to certain constituencies at different times, even as it was being appropriated by others. So what is striking is the continuity of the African-American reception, particularly of the second paragraph. They are the ones who turn the second paragraph into the very heart, the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, long before Abraham Lincoln really broadcasts that and makes it fundamental from his presidential bully pulpit, as it were. But for most white Americans, at least until the 1830s, celebrations of July the 4th are intermittent, and the veneration of the Declaration of Independence itself is also intermittent. Another good example is the Bill of Rights. After the ratification of the Constitution, manuscript copies of the Bill of Rights were sent to the then existing states. On the anniversary of that ratification in the middle of the 20th century, the then Librarian of Congress wrote to the states and said, "Can you send us your copies of this? We'd like to accumulate them all together." And I think something like 10 states simply couldn't find the Bill of Rights, which is also significant in the way in which we know, for instance, for political purposes, the Bill of Rights, particularly the Second Amendment, have been weaponized by particular political groups at certain moments since the 1960s or 70s. But until then, by and large, the Bill of Rights was a slumbering document. So these fundamental documents, even the most familiar, go underground, they get suppressed, they get pushed to one side, and then for contingent purposes, they're pulled back into conversation, sometimes enduringly, sometimes to drop out again.
It's an interesting area. I was thinking that during your lecture, David, that the issue of silences. I remember Dermot McCulloch's written well about it in terms of Christian history.
Absolutely.
But it presents different kinds of methodological challenge from other things to deal with. So, thank you. Next question is what you've described only one of many similar narratives, or is this story of retrospective influence unique? Is this a common phenomenon? Is what you've described only one of many similar narratives, or is this story of retrospective influence unique? Is this a common phenomenon?
I think it's probably more common than we admit. I was tasked happily to give a lecture for the 700th birthday of Arbroath and comparing it to later declarations, including the US Declaration. So that was the one that I elaborated. And I think it's more than merely a paradox to say it was 1776 that influenced 1320. Rather than the other way round, that it needs those contingent conditions and often the political impulses behind them to rediscover and to reconfigure, to use a more highfalutin term, to transvalue earlier documents and to give them novel meanings, particularly by attaching different names to them, which give them a different valence, which allow them to come into conversation with other prestigious documents. I mean, only speaking about documents in that sense, but I'm sure we could have a game show where we came up with many similar historical examples of that retrospective reconstruction, which I think is indeed a widespread phenomenon.
And a useful one for many people.
Absolutely, yes. A usable past becomes very useful in terms of that reconstruction, correct.
Next question says, you've written about the public role of history. What are the main things historians should try to do at anniversaries, and what are the main dangers? You've written about the public role of history. What are the main things historians should try to do at anniversaries, and what are the main dangers?
Well, I often say that the motto of the historian, or that should be engraved over every history department, is it's all very complicated, which is of course what many people don't want to hear, but I think it's an important message to communicate, is exactly to show that complexity of the past, that the veneration, whether it's of past figures or of past documents, may be imitating some of the darker moments of our past, unknowingly. It may be an aspect of much more present-minded motivations than we might wish to admit for ourselves, and the historian with the longer comparative perspective to be able to show the silences, the appropriations, the twists and turns in the reception history of particular objects allows us to do. But I think the historian's job, if this doesn't sound too moralistic, is at times to be a conscience, in a way, to say thus far and no further, or did you know this, which in fact makes this more complicated, therefore more interesting, therefore more enlightening, to have the multiple different facets presented of the object under study, not to rain on the parade of anyone's commemorations, but rather to show that the historical sense which is exhibited by anniversaries and commemorations is something which has both a public face and, let's say, a professionalized face. And those two things can come together to enrich public discussion rather than to prevent its proliferation. I think that's very important to say. We have a role maybe as a conscience to spark further inquiry, but not to shut it down, or certainly not to prevent historical engagement, which is absolutely crucial, of course.
And have you found, David, this is a follow-up question from me, have you educated in England and also in the States, you've lectured around much, if not most of the world. Being based in America, has that role of the historian as conscience been markedly different from that which you would find if you were working in England or in Scotland? Or
I believe so, yes, not least because of something as contingent as the institutional relations among academics and other scholars on the one hand, and the media in Britain. Much tighter connections, much as it were, smoother forms of communication of historical scholarship by those within and outside universities than is the case in the US. And I think also here in the United Kingdom, a much broader interest in a wider range of histories, not merely the national histories as well, whereas to a large extent to be a historian who is a public intellectual in the United States is to be somebody who studies the United States, not to study another country or even the articulation of the United States with other countries. So I think the ecologies are somewhat different, which allow for rather different constructions of exactly that role of the conscience, if one wants to go that far, of the historian.
Thank you. Next question says, is this going to be part of a wider project which will develop into a book about the development of ideas?
No, it's part of a much smaller project, at least for me. It's a continuation of work that I've been doing over some years on declarations of independence, the American Declaration in its context, and the spread of declarations of independence. To be very, very specific about it, a version of this will appear in the Scottish Historical Review at the end of this year, a special issue dedicated to the septennial of Arbroath, albeit only 2 years late. So the published version with full dress footnotes and all the evidence will be presented then, if your audience member can wait eagerly till December.
Well, I'm sure they will. Next question says, has Scottish historiography changed significantly during the re-emergence of Scottish nationalism?
Well, the short answer is yes, undoubtedly. That also interestingly coincides with the professionalisation of Scottish history and the expansion of the Scottish historical profession, and with professionalisation comes greater complexity, subtlety, openness to other historical methods and to comparisons and connections. So some of that, at least initially, was in reaction to perhaps less fully dimensional nationalist narratives, but I think the period since the 1950s up to the present is all Scottish historians would agree is the golden age of Scottish historiography, undoubtedly, and it's one of the liveliest national but not necessarily nationalist historiographies that I'm aware of, and it's something I've been engaged with both in research at various times, but also tried to keep up with it simply because of its model sophistication. Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Next question is looking at the way in which this relates to global history, and says, do these comparisons extend well beyond the Western Anglophone tradition?
It's a very good question in the sense that to my knowledge so far, we don't have any studies of the circulation of Arbroath beyond what we might call the North Atlantic world in either Latin or in English. It doesn't mean that it didn't or hasn't circulated elsewhere, but simply the research has not been done on that. Research has been done. I've done some of it on the circulation of the US Declaration of Independence as an index of the spread of global norms, of statehood, of independence, of declaring independence, for instance. But I'm not aware of anyone engaged on a global history of the Declaration of Arbroath or the New Metal Manifesto, whatever we want to call it. But it would be worth interrogating that. I'd be surprised if there were not Scots on the Australian goldfields in the 1850s who were invoking Arbroath. For instance, there may be Scottish settlers in Latin America in the late 19th century who remembered it for their own purposes. But if they're out there, I'm not aware of them yet, but that doesn't mean that they're not ready to be investigated. So maybe somebody listening, maybe an enterprising master's student or PhD student could take that on as a possibility. I think
it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it might have concentric circles, which would...
Absolutely.
Next question says, what are the implications of your analysis of these documents for thinking about Irish declarations of independence?
Yes, well, of course, Ireland has a Declaration of Independence, much later one, and I'm sure one, if one had the knowledge, which I don't have, one could do a parallel lecture south of the border, comparing the remonstrance of the Irish princes of 1317, commemorated. I showed the picture there in Dublin Castle in the 1780s, so that's mythologized in the Age of Revolutions as well. Comparing that with the Irish Declaration of Independence, I think there would be real potential for that. But I'm not aware of the same kind of mythologization of the Irish remonstrance as a proto-Irish Declaration of Independence in the way that Arbroath was appropriated and renamed as the Scottish Declaration of Independence, particularly after the Second World War. Again, I may be wrong, just out of ignorance, but I don't think there's a direct parallel there in terms of that transvaluation within the language of declarations of independence in a post-colonial setting. There would be, especially when you have an existing national declaration of independence already at that point, you don't need retrospectively to excavate one from the deeper past.
Well, we may get you back, David, to discuss those Irish implications of it again. We've worked you very hard, you've delivered a brilliant lecture, and you've covered a wide range of questions, which I should say, in a number of cases, thanks to this new way of having audiences that have come from different parts of the world, and have actually involved questions from those different geographical locations. In closing this lecture, 3 words of thanks. I'd like to renew my thanks to colleagues in the Mitchell Institute and in the Development and Alumni Relations Office here at Queen's for organising today's event. I'd like to thank you, the audience members, both for joining the lecture and also for the wide-ranging and sharp-sighted questions, but particularly for a brilliant lecture, as I say, very sophisticated lecture, a very contextually powerful lecture, and for a wonderful fielding of questions across a lot of difficult areas, very sharply and very eloquently. I know everyone would want to join me in thanking our R.M. Jones lecturer for 2022, Professor David Armitage. Thank you.
Thank you.